Boop. Happy Monday. Today is Monday, May the 17th, 2021, and today's daily Bible readings come to us from Psalm 115, Exodus 28:29 through 38, and then Philippians 1:3 through 11, and I'm going to talk about Exodus 28:29 through 38, and talk about judgment and leadership. So the priests of Israel, right, that we see being set up here in Exodus, they were set up as judges over Israel. They were leaders over Israel, and their job was to judge Israel, right? They kind of helped Moses out in that job, and that's what God is setting up here. And so, but they weren't above the people. I think that's maybe kind of a misconception that we have. It's sort of the way we think of it. When we think of leadership and judges today, we think about people who are really above the rest of us. They're set above the rest of us, set apart, but specifically set above, that they're better than everyone else, and that they're in a position to lord it over the rest of us. But that's not really the way that the priests were. Like I said, I know we get it that way, but when I think of it, what I've come to understand is that they were really alongside the people. They were set apart from the people, but they were really set alongside of the people. Specifically, they were in between the people and God. They stood in this gap for the sake of the people. And they stood in that gap on behalf of God. So it was an important place to be, but it wasn't a safe place to be either. And they were there to exercise and convey God's judgment to the people, for the people, in between the people, for the people's sake, like I said, and not for their own sake. And I think that's probably the major problem that we have today, is when we think of people, or we strive to get into positions of power and leadership and judgment like that, we might think of it as being something for our own good, as much as we might couch it in language of, I really just want. A lot of times what we see it devolve into, and pretty quickly, unfortunately, is really people getting into those positions for their own sake and for their own benefit. And even if they had the best intentions and the deepest heart of hearts, they seem to forget that pretty quickly. But God was doing everything he could so that the priests wouldn't forget it. They were not to forget the fact that they stood in between. They weren't above the people. They just stood in between the people and God. And everything about the way we see God setting up the priestly garments, their uniform, talks about that. But especially this pouch that we're talking about, the breastplate, the breast piece that the high priest, Aaron in this case, was the first high priest, right, was supposed to wear on his chest. And it says that he was to bear the judgment on his heart, right? This breast piece, which was to hold these two things, these two stones, called the Urim and the Thummim, and this is how they would decide, right? The understanding is that he'd reach into the darkness of this pouch and, pose the question to God, reach in, and one would be yes, one would be no, and that was the answer from God. And, it's interesting to me because it could have just been a pouch, right? And why not a Yahtzee cup? Like Bronze Age Yahtzee. But it was a breast piece, which was, a garment that they understood. They got it, because they'd been in Egypt and all those priests had these, big, fancy, but this breast piece, and it goes into more detail about what the outside's supposed to look like. But this was so the priest could bear on his heart, as it says here, thus Aaron shall bear the judgment of the Israelites on his heart before the Lord continually. And I have to think that would have been a weighty thing to make you remember that you're really not above the people. You're alongside the people, and specifically you stand in this gap between them and God. And the job that you have is really, really serious. You're bearing it on your heart. It's not just some kind of pouch that you carry on your belt and you shake it up and Yahtzee out the answer. This is you standing in that gap between the people and their God continually. It was high stakes for a high stake calling, and it wasn't this position of, what's in it for me. It was this position of what's in it for God's people. So anyway, that's the DBR for today. We'll be back tomorrow. Get outside, enjoy the day. We'll see you later. Boop.